Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's BA session, in which I'm pleased to be joined by two excellent guests to talk about analysis planning. Okay. So my first guest, Lynn Girvan. Would you mind, Lynn, giving an introduction to yourself, please?
Not a problem at all. Thank you very much. Lovely to be here, John. So I'm Lynda Girvan. I'm Head of Business Analysis and Agile at CMC Partnership Consultancy Limited. I've been working in business analysis for probably about 30 years. And I've co-authored two books on the subject, one with Deborah Paul, which was Agile and Business Analysis, and the other was Agile from First Principles, which I co-authored with my husband. And Deborah and I are just about to put our second edition of Agile and BA out as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lynn. And Rajiv.
Hi, guys. Hi, John. I think I'm pleased as well to join this forum. So I've been working as a lead business analyst for the last 20 years across financial institutions, business media firms, and oil trading and risk management sector. But currently, I lead the BA practice in what we refer as wholesale banking, front office, marketing, and sustainability. That's the current division I work in. And I'm quite pleased to join this so that we can share some BA insights. I would learn some and hopefully share with others.
That's right. Thank you. Brilliant. Well, you've already confirmed that the right people for this session. That's already the case. Thank you. So, Lynn, if I could start with you first, and just inquire upon the typical BA approach that you might have or you might recommend for people is in terms of how they might go about planning their analysis, please.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, because I think there's two questions there. Why do you need to plan it? And I think it's often because we're working to schedules. And secondly, what do you need to plan for? Because a lot of people don't actually plan the analysis. It's almost like some miracle happens and it just, whatever the project manager says, they're like, oh, you can get that done in 3 weeks, can't you? And no, actually. So how do I go about planning? Well, first of all, I like to have at least a scope of what the problem space is. So we need to know what problem we're solving. If I know what we're trying to do in terms of the problem space, even if we don't know what the problem is, I at least need to know what the range of stakeholders are that are going to be engaged. So is there a sponsor? How many departments is it spanning, or organizations even, the problem space that we're trying to attack? How many people are affected by that? So therefore, how much engagement I'm going to need to do with those. Once I've understood that, then I might think about different approaches for how I'm going to engage to do that analysis. Am I going to run workshops? Am I going to have one-to-one interviews? Who are they going to be with? How am I going to engage the seniors early? What information's already been said? What's been done? Am I going to run a survey? All of those sort of things. How many people do I need to reach in order to engage and get that feedback? How am I going to capture it? How am I going to document it? How am I going to take unstructured information and present that into something which is structured? Am I going to use process models? Am I going to use rich pictures? What is the appetite within that organization for that level of documentation? When do we need an answer by? Can I take a subset of stakeholders and do some analysis early without doing all of the analysis? For instance, could I take one department? Could I take one smaller problem space and model that? And that allows some work to be continuing while I go back and then do the other. So to avoid that analysis paralysis, big upfront requirements. So I think, to me, my analysis planning starts with a lot of questions. But I think, that's the nature of the beast with analysis, isn't it? It is about asking questions. So I think you have to have a little bit of understanding. If you're going to speak or engage with people, who are those people? How do you engage with them? How are you going to capture that information and document it or engage with that data, the information that you've got? How are you going to share that? How are you going to analyze that information, and how are you going to put it into something which is tangible and gives you your next steps? So I've touched on that broadly because I think, it might be good to get Rajiv to sort of share his thoughts as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Certainly, you've given a brilliant introduction to many of the things that we quite rightly should be thinking about and highlight to follow. So, Rajiv, over to you, please.
Oh, I think Lynn kind of has covered primarily the kind of approach you would take for business analysis, right? I mean, asking the first question itself, why do we need business planning? Yeah. Because typically it follows through a planning which a project manager or program manager might have done. and you have to just fit into that planning cycle. But I believe, rightly so, a kind of the success of a project depends on, because requirements is the core part of delivering a project. Whether you are doing a system implementation, you're making a business process change, you need to be doing planning. And I think in a way, Lynn kind of covered primarily the approach you take, but because this is the area where I do a lot of mentoring within my area, primarily for the mid-senior or junior BAs. I do two key tips I tell them, right? Whatever task you do it, whether it's analysis or any other job you do, you always need to know what is the context, right? What is the context in which you're doing the planning, right? The most obvious one is, are you doing high-level requirements gathering, or you're at the detail level? Someone already has done, in a way, what Lynn has already covered is, do you have enough documentation? Do you have someone who has already done it? If it's an enterprise level requirements gathering, has someone done the legwork for you? And you have to do the detailed analysis, right? If you're doing an initial inception stage, and that's what when I say context is, what is the stage of the project? What department level you're doing it, whether you're doing a small project, you're doing system implementation, the nature of the context, right? And the one thing is, if I use that terminology, whether you're doing high level requirements analysis or a detailed requirements analysis, if you're doing high level, ensure the tip is avoid boiling the ocean, right? And don't fall into the analysis paralysis. If you are doing that high level analysis to come up with an approach of how large the project is, right? You don't need to be doing detailed analysis. But whenever you're doing that, right, in terms of not avoiding or saying not to boil the ocean in terms of requirements gathering, you always weigh that against being too superficial as well. You need to find the right balance of not doing too superficially requirements gathering and thereby missing the blind spots. So those I would say the tips, right? Never boil the ocean when you're doing high level analysis. But if you're doing detail level analysis, don't be too superficial because you will miss the blind spots. And the other tip is, howsoever good or experience you may have in a specific domain, be it business domain or the technology which it might be looking at, always rely on key SMEs, right? Because those are the folks who can support your analysis. Identify your key SMEs who you can rely to check the analysis you have done works, right? And then once you have gathered or used that kind of key hints, then you fall into the same analysis approach or planning approach that one, first and foremost, who are your stakeholders? Identify your stakeholders, right? Then put in the right analysis approach, how you're going to do the analysis. And the last one is, what is the right governance structure so that you can replay back those requirements and get sign off on. So if someone is at the door, give me a second, but I'll be back here.
We can talk amongst ourselves.
Perfect time for me to switch over, I guess, and build on it, because there's certainly some really appropriate points that were made there. I mean, covering around the questions, obviously, which you touched on a moment ago, Lynn, talking about as well, not trying to plan everything and do everything all at once, but then build on the point Rajiv made as well in terms of contextualizing and thinking as well. I mean, I would also add priorities to that. So once you've got a view of almost like the context of why you're doing the analysis, having a view of the types of deliverables or analysis that needs to be done, having a view of what the priority of those deliverables are, and having a view on which stakeholders you're going to engage. That enables you to formulate the question, your first set of questions really, and maybe put them to that first group. And I think just by having that process in place already, where you're not putting too much pressure on yourself from the start to plan everything up front in detail, naturally, I think, encourages you to introduce an adaptive approach where you can change and react to new information or change as the project needs you to. And I think one good example of that, I feel like in the early days of my analysis planning, is whilst I will plan to familiarise myself with the scope and the objectives and to speak to the business leaders or sponsors, I know my approach is not something I'm going to really worry too much about until I understand who my customers are, whether they're within IT or within the vendors or within business. And once I understand who my customers are, what is it they need of me? How best works with them, and what's the team makeup as well. And I think I'm sure everyone can appreciate the amount of the question points you added, the various points that Rajiv added as well, means that there isn't a one-size-fits-all planning approach, but there is a whole bunch of considerations that we need to maybe apply more than others in some cases, and a number of techniques to bring together. But ultimately, it's I guess having that awareness that we need to plan. And I think probably the thing that also occurs to me as you were talking is that, you know, planning of analysis isn't something that we just do as BA managers or as lead BAs. It's actually something that we do as you know, as any BA in the team. You know, because for example, if I have a team of BAs, and I would expect them, whether that's before, after, in fact, it's before, after, and during, to have a view of how they're going to approach their own particular piece of analysis, and how that's going to tie in with the wider analysis of the team, and then how that's going to have an influence on the deliverables of the project, as an example. So,
a good point there, John. And I think if I could just pick up on something you said, which I think is relevant in this context, is, you know, we talk about stakeholders, but you actually said, who is your customer? And I think this is really, really important, because organizations are shifting now. Things are outsourced. We work in a service organization where people provide different services to an organization, or services are outsourced. But as a BA, not one thing that you produce as a business analyst, you know, or when you're doing analysis, is for yourself, is it? And I think that one of the anti-patterns, if you like, or I would call it a bad practice, is where you see, you know, business analysts sort of throwing the book at the analysis stage and going, well, I have to do all of these things, but they don't know who's going to consume it. You know, who's consuming that model they're creating? Who's going to look at it and have value in it and seek it? And actually, really what we want to think about is business analysis as a service. So when we're doing our business analysis planning, who is the customer of the service that we're providing in that context? And then we need to co-create value with those people. So if I'm working, you know, with the development team, you know, I'll be saying to them, look, you know, what do we agree is definition of ready? You know, how much elaboration do you need me to do, or how much do you want to do yourselves? You know, at what level? How do we collaborate over that interface so that it's not a throw over the fence? If I'm working with you know, seniors, and they're going to be making decisions as a result of my analysis, I want to ensure that the artifacts or the outputs of my analysis are things that they can make those informed decisions on. What format do they want it in? I will often sort of sketch out a draft and share it early and say, is this the sort of thing you want? What I don't want to do is spend 3 weeks writing a beautiful document only to find that none of the content in there is actually what they wanted. So I think this term of value co-creation is really, really key in how we operate and work with others in order to make sure whatever we're doing in our analysis is the right type of analysis for the right type of customer. I just thought I'd throw that in there because you threw the idea into my head there, John, so I couldn't resist.
That's fine. I think you saying the idea, well, as soon as you talk about throwing and the idea, it made me think about, you know, those situations, and maybe it's an expectation from some, that some BAs, like, they almost just chuck the requirements to the next part of the process and don't really, you know, I'm sure we all care, most of us, as to who the recipient is, but I think by not knowing your customer, not knowing that it's a development team, it's colleagues within tech that are going to receive your requirements, then you're not personalizing the recipient of what you're producing. And therefore, it probably is easier to throw things over the fence and not care whether they've received it and they understand it. Whereas if you know the person or the group you're handing it to, I think we naturally take more responsibility to ensure that they are capable of receiving it in the manner in which it's sent. So I'm glad
no project failed because there was too much or too little documentation. Projects generally fail because of people, don't they?
That's it.
Completely agree. Yeah, right. And I mean, John and Lynn, I heard 3 specific phrases which I think I will pick on, right? Adaptability, right? I mean, which is equivalent to, you can't go with premeditated techniques, right? Because it would need to change depending who your stakeholder is. I have very senior stakeholders who go too detailed, and you need that information. Whereas most typical senior stakeholders would say, I don't want to go through 10 pages documents, give me the gist of it and I can sign off on that basis, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to change or tweak your BA technique and the artifacts depending on who your stakeholder is. The second phrase you use was know your customer. Most of the projects fail because you have delegated stakeholders and not the end customer who's going to consume the process, right? So,
Yeah.
and thereby differentiating needs to ask, right? This is my ask, but what's the actual need? Who can give you the right purpose of the project, right? Rather than, or the ask, rather than just talk about my stakeholders' view, rather than the end customer's view.
Yeah.
And I think the other phrase you use for co-creation, which is collaboration itself, right? And I will give you a quick 2 examples per se. We write typical user stories. We are in the agile phase. We write user stories, and exactly what Lynn was touching on, right? Detailed, beautiful user stories. And the same BA moved on from one team to the other, and they write beautiful user stories, but the team would not consume the user story, won't read the user story. They'll say, let's join together in a collaborative space, let's understand the purpose. And then, yes, for ensuring that my definition of that is met, then I go and look at user story. So you might be spending too much time having the best user story, but if the purpose is collaboration, co-creation, then you know to change your tack, right? Because the detail is not what they're looking for. It's the people involved, the consumers should be understanding what's being the purpose of it, right? So
I think planning your collaboration actually is one of those really key things that leads on to, because without planning the collaboration, you're really not getting the best out of the team, and you're not giving yourself the chance to adapt as you go through. I mean certainly one example of a project that I recall whenever I talk about this, there was a project a few years ago I was on, and what a team would typically do is if there was a particular piece of work we had to do, then maybe we might write it down, or we might put scant detail around the requirement. But generally, we get the team together, be that the development team, the test team, the architects, the BAs, etc., and the business, and just talk this situation through and try and understand, from all perspectives, what the requirements are. And by having the development team involved and the testers involved, they could ask questions there and then. And as BAs, we could, maybe sometimes we would get involved and actually try and translate some of the questions, if for want of a better word, and maybe put them into a way that some of the business stakeholders would understand. But in fairness, most of the time that wasn't necessary. So you just benefit from that early collaboration. You discuss what the requirements are live, and then the BA has enough information to go away and retrospectively capture the salient points to act as a basis on which to test. So so you've nicely, Rajiv, there taken us into another important area that we have to consider planning, and that's that collaboration. It's interesting as well. I think you both potentially taken us down a route towards the next question, or at least touching on some of the topics I had as the next question, and which is around the differences, your perception of the difference between your analysis approach in a agile environment versus a more traditional or even hybrid environment. So it'd be interesting to get your views, and perhaps Rajiv, I might start with you first on this one.
I think, so the obvious response to that would be, obviously the artifact slightly changes, right? The approach of requirements gathering might be similar. The degree of requirements gathering might be different, right? Because if you think about a specific ask, right, you would write your business requirements document, you write your functional requirements document, and you go to the full detail of actually specifying everything in one single document, right? That's I would say, at least my experience of typical agile, waterfall delivery, where you would actually ensure that you have a singular document talking about all your requirements, business requirements, if you are the one doing business, as well as functional requirements. And the other part is the collaboration part of, right? It's handoff. So you have a requirements phase, and then there is a development phase, right? Obviously, and the iteration of change to requirements, generally it would be, you do your delivery and then seek feedback at the end of that. And your iteration phase would be much longer in case of waterfall, because you would deliver something, and typically, because you have a full business functional requirement, you would deliver substantial amount of change before you get feedback. Whereas approach similar, but the detail would be slightly different, because you would potentially break down, and I think that's what Agile is about, is break down your problem into smaller problems and tackle that in terms of prioritization, in terms of highest business value first, and the aspect of even lowest complex thing first, low hanging fruits first, right? So it could be any combination of that. So you go to the right detail of breaking down your requirements into smaller user stories as we keep using. The terminology, the artifacts is slightly different. And the context is slightly different as well. Because when you talk about business requirements, you talk it from business requirements perspective side of things. As a functional requirement, you think about system behaviors or the functional process itself. As a user story, you're putting, again, if you're talking about system, the user of the system and from their perspective. And you have clear identification of acceptance criteria to define whether the user story is complete. The artifacts, the degree of detail, but I think the approach might be similar. And obviously, the main thing is how the delivery is actually done. The collaboration is much more in terms of agile, and in terms of the expectation also from the delivery team is much more. Where in waterfall, you would expect that the delivery team is waiting for requirements, whereas in the agile, the delivery team is part of the creation of the requirements because they will give early feedback. You have your 3 amigo sessions in agile where you get early feedback from a development and testing team, and you incorporate those feedback upfront rather than wait for delivery to happen, or as Lynn used the word, check it across the fence, let them consume it, and then you figure out what's happening, right? So I think those would be the obvious first things which comes to my mind.
And just for anyone that doesn't know, would you mind just explaining what you mean by 3 amigos?
Oh, 3 amigos, right? So I think that's a common term which used in Agile, right? Where the 3 amigos being the BA or the requirements provider. So if you're working in a pod structure, then the product owner is one of the amigos. Then it's the developer who is building that, and then the tester or even the consumer, depending on how the team is structured, right? So in some teams, you may not have a tester because everything is automation testing, and then the consumer is a third amigo. So in this case, BA, dev, and tester, I would say 3 amigos, which might slightly change depending on how your team and structure is built.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rajiv. And Lynn, just build on that if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah,
not the 3 amigo piece, obviously.
Yeah, not the 3 amigos. No. So I think it's really interesting actually, because my approach doesn't necessarily change. It's just how quickly I work through my approach. So, in Agile, requirements don't go out the window because you're working in an Agile way. You still have to go from high level requirement to solution. I just don't want to take 6 months to get there. So I have to, like Rajiv said, you've got to take a big problem and it's about breaking the problems down. What can I do the earliest first? Yeah, I think what people forget about Agile is really about feedback. If you're not getting feedback, there is no Agile. You're just doing waterfall faster, right? It's just, there's no Agile in it if you're not getting that feedback and you're not taking that feedback and course correcting what you're doing. So you're going up and down, up and down. I think the other thing is just reminding ourselves, what we mean by scope of a project as well. I mean, in the quality triangle concept, waterfall is actually agreeing the scope first. And you said that with Inception, you would agree the scope first, and then you'd cost up, wouldn't you? How long and how much will it cost to achieve that to this level of quality? And that's waterfall. But actually, Agile flips that around completely and it turns it on its head. And it says, actually, with this amount of time, how much scope can we deliver? With this amount of time and money, how much scope can we deliver? And so the time and money is actually your iteration, your sprint, your cadence, your delivery cycle is the time and money and how much you can achieve within that time and money. However, if you've got a project and you're saying, how much of this can I achieve with this amount of time and money, you still need to know what you're trying to achieve overall. You might not have it all mapped out. And I think this is where we get into where analysis sometimes get lost, because I think people can rush through these things and we lose context. We lose the broader understanding. We don't have to do analysis, flat out and do this big upfront analysis and have it all mapped out. But I might want to use some really good analysis techniques that help me maintain some sort of context of where we're trying to go. And that could be a high level use case model or a process model or something where I'll go, do you know what, let's break down that little bit first, but let's go and see what we understand and then come back to this picture and go, is it still valid? Is what we've got still valid, or actually do we want to bite off a little bit more of the thing that we've looked at, or do we want to dig into another area and delve into there? And all the time you're really just saying, how do I go from high level requirement, in a conceptual world, and when you're talking about requirements high level, it's conceptual. There's nothing confirmed, there's nothing agreed at that stage. How do I get it to a point that I flip it across the line into solution space? And then how do I take that solution space all the way through to implementation? And I like to call that, idealization to realization. And until you realize that requirement, i.e. you've delivered something and the user has said it's of value or it's valuable, you won't know whether the next thing you're going to do is the right thing. So it's that iterating straight all the way from high level to low level all of the time, and coming back with the feedback and cycling through that process constantly. And as you're doing that, you're building out that broader picture of what you think you might need, but also what you've got as well, what you've delivered. And it's actually more complicated than waterfall. Waterfall was so much simpler because you could do that inception phase, you could lock it all in. I don't think it was effective, but in today's challenging world, we can't possibly do that now, because the world keeps changing, and what you thought you needed 6 months ago is not what you need 6 months later. So we have to create an environment where we can be adaptive, and we don't lock requirements down. We don't want to have signed off requirements, but we still have to know where we're trying to get to. We still have to do some analysis, and we still have to do some documentation. And I sort of feel in all of this, excuse me, when we were in the waterfall way, there was a very structured way of getting from high level to requirement down to system requirement. There was a really structured way of articulating it. We knew high level requirements got broken down. We understood that. We had traceability between all of the things. I'm not advocating we have all of that again. But I think in the rush to move to Agile and this ability to do everything very, very small, I think we've lost that context. We've lost that ability to create structure. And I can probably demonstrate that by just asking you both. And I don't expect you to answer, but if I asked you to define what an epic is or what a feature is, I bet all three of us would have very different definitions. And I think that's part of the problem that we've got in today with a lot of this understanding about where we apply our analysis, is that there are too many definitions and there isn't one definition. So everyone's talking at different points at the same time in the same project. And, whereas I think before it was much clearer, we had a structured, methodical approach to it. And somehow we need to put something in that allows us still to be methodical, but still be adaptive. And I feel there's something missing in our work at the moment that's not achieving that.
Yeah, so definitely I agree with all of that, to be honest, Lynn. And I'm glad you said that generally your approach isn't changing as a BA. I think the things you do as a BA are largely the same irrespective. It's just the order in which you do them, and to the points that Rajiv was making, you're putting the outputs in different places. What I find really interesting though is that there's someone who's done, started off doing very traditional waterfall analysis and filling in those documents like the BRD and business requirements, etc., to then go into that Agile stage. Having been in there, you find that actually the lessons you learn from Agile and the way that you construct and think about your stories and the way that you put them can be used equally in waterfall. So there's no rules to say that you can't take the construct of a user story and actually relay your business requirements in that manner. In fact, if everyone did so, we'd probably have better requirements as a basis. But keeping that, maybe. But by having be an open mind and seeing, what we can take from Agile, what we can take from waterfall, and applying it in the right situation, I think it is really key. I think, and I guess it goes on then to maybe my last question to you both in terms of, how might you, I guess one bugbear of mine is typically status reporting and reporting to the project and to the program, who always seem to be waterfall in nature, irrespective of whether the delivery teams are Agile. So I wondered if you have any tips to help those BAs basically focus on valuable analysis rather than spending too much time reporting on status over and over again. So I'll start with you, Lynda, if I may.
Yeah. I could talk about this till the cows come home, really. But I think what is valuable in this context? My requirements document is not valuable, really. It's a means to an end. I could argue code has no value on its own either. Actually, the only value that comes out of this entire process is working software. It's a feature. It's delivered. It's something that has changed the life of a customer or end user, and really that's what we ought to be measuring. And on most of the projects I've worked, we measure stuff going in, but we don't measure really stuff going out. And that, so rather than measuring the time it takes for how long it gets, that process, that analysis process gets to the delivery, there's no value in any of that. The actual value is how much comes out. And if what's coming out isn't valuable or isn't the right thing, that's the thing we ought to be measuring. I see a lot of projects where backlogs for the development teams are full of technical tasks, but they're not full of value-driven requirements. And I'm using the word requirements because I don't really care whether it's a user story or whether it's a requirement or a use case or whatever, but they're not defined in the way that there's valuable to the person that's going to receive the software as a result of all of this work. So they never have the right acceptance criteria. I mean, if you are using BDD and you're writing test-driven test-driven development, test scripts early, then those are the things you want to be measuring, and actually measuring the impact on the end user. I could say we got 20 requirements delivered, but if they're not valuable to the end user and it hasn't changed their lives or delighted them in any way, is it valuable just because it's being delivered? So I think there's a next step as well, and then there's the impact that working software has had on the community or the customer that it was meant for. Has it made efficiency savings? And so it's all that benefits realization as well. I think we can test about whether the right thing got delivered, but we don't really know it's the right thing until it's in the hands of the consumer, and only the consumer can tell you whether it's the right thing. So everything to the left of that, everything to the left of that really isn't worth measuring in my view. But if everything to the right of that isn't getting the right results, then you've got to change everything to the left of that. Does that make sense? I sort of want to draw a V model almost.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's worth measuring the input. I think we're going to measure the output.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's I think if every BA thinks about what it is they're producing rather than necessarily how they produce it, then it might again put that more of that focus on the customer, because if you're creating something for a customer, that's the focus to have rather than how you produce that, because really the customer doesn't necessarily care how you get there, just what you hand over to them.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
So definitely but very personal points, Lynn, that's for sure. Rajiv, I wonder if you have a perspective on that as well.
I think Lynn was spot on, right? What should be measured is the working software, right? And I would kind of share a kind of view is sometimes we have seen scenarios where the devs have delivered something what you have not asked for, but what they've delivered is what the business want, right? They have delivered something more, which if you go by specific measurements, it may be wrong, right? Or it's more than what's been asked for. But it might actually be good because they have delivered something which the other story is yet to be picked up, and he or she doesn't know that they have worked on something else, which is down the line, right? And hence I'm saying when you present the working software in front of the business, it doesn't matter whether the user story has been done to the T. It's about whether the working software works for the business, right?
Yes.
And hence that's what we should be measuring, not that my definition of done has been met. Yes, obviously you should, because that's the way to ensure that there are less bugs and potentially, as Lynn was talking about TDD, right? In terms of your automation suite percentage is high, right? Again, there's no point having 100% tests, which might be in the wrong scenarios, but you have an end product which doesn't work. So end product measurement highest. The original question around reporting, it is about the influence you can make to those stakeholders who ask for reporting, right? You might be trying your best to say, okay, we'll give you a demo. That demo is fine. Whoever is asking, they need to report someone higher, right, in terms of reporting. And I think this is where we have tried to influence our stakeholders saying, you're working in Agile, you have 10 features, right? what we'll do is we can actually come together, bring all the stakeholders together and provide you demos through that. And our demos, system demos is your reporting in terms of where we are with things, right? So that we do have, again, because we're in Agile, we do releases, controlled releases weekly, but we can do more so every day as well, but control releases. So we have just 15-minute sessions, right, where we do system demos. And that's the reporting in terms of where we are. And we tell them we're 70% there, 80% there. So they have a view that we are on track or not. Because there, as we say, if you just create a plan, status, right, but the business sees something and they change their mind or they ask for more, that the goalpost shifts because they have given feedback early, right? So that's the way we say that you look at the software and that's your actual status report in terms of what we have. But obviously, that's the influence which you need to do. There are cases we fail miserably and we have to create status reports, and then we do that. And basically do it in terms of, if you're doing analysis reporting, which is within the team, we just do it in terms of where we are at a feature level, story level, and we just talk about the resource allocation, that thing kind of thing. Resource allocation we're talking about whether we have broken down the feature into 10 stories. We are 8 are already in the dev funnel and there are 2 which is pending. So those kind of things is what additional reporting we can do, but that nothing can make a reporting higher than actually a working software.
That's right.
And actually, if you've got a good, sorry, John, I didn't mean to cut in. But if you've got a good flow system like Kanban or whatever you want to use to manage that flow system, that's all visible anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I've always said to you, be careful what you measure, because, you know, if you measure the wrong things, you don't get the right, you know, people game the system. So if you measure how many requirements have been delivered, they'll just make smaller requirements. You know, if you measure how many story points they're delivering, then they'll just make all their story points bigger. You know, you just got to be careful what you measure, because if you measure the wrong things, you drive the wrong behavior. And so, yeah, whereas it's irrefutable whether something that was the outcome of it was valuable or not.
Right. I will pick on that because that's the bugbear of when I look at BA practice across organization, because they'll try to compare one pod with another pod, right? And what are they comparing on story points? Yeah. Every team has their own story point, so that's not the measure to be going for. And then we moved on to what was talking about working software, right? So there's one of the other metrics which the team and the organization is moving towards is what you refer as how many release per person in the pod are made, right? And if you have 10 people, right, obviously BAs don't do check-ins, and we are now thinking about whether BAs could do check-ins as well to kind of, in a way, fudge the numbers, right? Because we are just checking in so that we can be counted in the number of person who are doing the check-ins. So yeah, it needs to be careful in what we are measuring and what's the end objective of that.
Yeah. I think on that, I mean, the big lesson to take away from this is that, you know, if you can encourage your senior stakeholders, your sponsors, to actually come and view the product as it's being created, I think that's a perfect time to encourage them to come down regularly or come over regularly or review regularly, because then they'll see that working software, that product take shape. And I think then they'll be comfortable with the delivery of the team, irrespective of whether there is a status report that says green, red, or amber, or otherwise. You know, and I think that if the people, your customers you're delivering this to, are satisfied with the development and the way you're approaching it, and satisfied by coming and having a look at the system themselves, then there is no one else to report to as such. You know.
Yeah, it's funny, we do this portfolio planning, don't we? Well, people, like you say, people go out and they give a RAG status to a project. And, you know, if you've got 2 projects, one's got a really experienced project manager, but, you know, he's everything's green on there. And then you've got an inexperienced one because he's overestimated everything and he's put in like 50% contingency on everything. So his project's green. And then you've got the inexperienced project manager who's got a red flag on theirs because they thought they estimated it correctly with the right level of contingency. Which one do you punish?
That's it. It reminds me of a saying I always sometimes introduce, which is is it better to hit the deadline with a bad delivery or actually slightly go over with exactly the right delivery? And I'm sure if you give the option to most people, they'll take a slight delay or maybe a little bit less functionality, but for it to be right.
But either way, either of those metrics aren't accurate, so why bother? You know,
Yeah.
either way, whether it's red or whether it's green, if they've both done things differently, they're not metrics at all, are they?
No, not at all.
Yeah, I think it's just management attention, right? If it is red,
Yeah.
then bring more people into the ground to help them out or say what
Yeah.
help we can do, right? And that's the different ways to do that. But I think the main thing we should ask is how many times we have seen a report in front of us which was green this week but turned red next week, right? Versus you see a demo and you know that it's comfortable, so it's on the right direction compared to something which changes colors weekly or monthly, right?
100%. Yeah. Demonstratable. I think that's the word we're going for.
And probably a good place to for me to pause the questions anyway. That's for sure. I think before we close entirely, are there any other points that either of you think are relevant to share in terms of BA planning and analysis planning? Any additional ones, I should say. You've more than given enough, that's for sure.
I think I just wanted to add something else, and I'll just throw this out there, and maybe anybody who's watching this later can add comments. But I think there's a little bit of us throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and in this bid to try and come up with new ways of thinking, we've created a set of terminology which doesn't make any sense anymore. You know, things like use cases are really good techniques that can be utilized and were actually meant to be iterative and incremental, you know, briefly described all the way through to fully described, sequence diagramming around it. You don't have to do all of it. You don't have to understand it all up front to make that a useful technique. Yet it's been thrown out of the water in favor for things like user stories. User stories were never actually meant to be a requirement. They were meant to be a collaboration tool, right? So I wouldn't say they're more structured than something like a use case. You know, whether a feature is a feature in terms of something valuable or whether it's just a big chunk of stuff that needs to get done. You know, is a value stream a use case, or is a use case a value stream? Is a customer journey a process, or is it a use case? You know, I think somehow we've just got to get on top of this and stop throwing new words out there and say, at the end of the day, we've got big requirements and we need to get them through, you know, that are conceptual, and we need to then flip them into something we're going to, you know, build. It's going to be resulting in noughts and ones, and then that becomes the requirement. Everything outside of that isn't a requirement. It's just a conceptual wish list of needs that needs to be understood, analyzed and prioritized so we can flip it into solution space, and then we prioritize the solution space, and then we test it. And I think we've thrown out a lot of really good analysis techniques that can really support us, and we're not utilizing them today. So I say bring some of them back.
Yeah, there we go. Definitely. Yeah. Rajiv, any points for you to add before?
I think I think we have talked about most of it, right? But I would just kind of give a tip, right? That, I mean, in the Agile world, I would say the main thing, I would repeat this phrase, which I use before: know your context. Identify and learn what your team needs to deliver something, right? And change to that. You might maybe start off with something which you have done before, see whether it works for your team, and adapt, change it so that you know, to see what your team needs so that we can meet that. And yeah, don't boil the ocean when you don't need to, right? And basically, there's a term which we use in our team, right? Do just-in-time analysis. You need to just do just enough to ensure your team has the right knowledge, and you have to work collaboratively with your dev and testing team so that they can deliver what they need. You may have an inexperienced team, and then yes, you need to do too much of documentation to ensure that they have everything written. But sometimes you will have a very experienced team where you don't need to do that, and you might spend your time more valuable things, find the more unknowns, and provide the easier ones to carry on your able team to deliver, right? So I think that's what I would leave this with, right? Know your team, identify what they really need to deliver the project or the work stream, and tweak your analysis artifacts and techniques to that.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I'd add on both of those points, as well as all the good things that have been said today, is that, you know, try and inject some transparency right from the start, because we've all been talking about some really good things, you know, the BAs, the developers, the collaborative team. Without the transparency, nobody outside the team is going to know. So if you can find a way, whether it's Confluence pages, internal websites, sharing what you're doing, whatever mechanism works for you, just get your stuff out there, get it transparent. And then you're not also relying on putting pressure on yourself to come up with all the right answers all the time. You know, encourage people to give you feedback if they need to change or tweak or whatever ideas as well. Before I get on my soapbox about that one, I'll leave it there.
That's another subject, surely, John.
It probably is. It probably is. So, but thank you both for your time, and obviously for your excellent and expert input as well. I've learned something as usual, and hopefully those outside of us
same here.
Trio have as well. But thank you once again, and I look forward to speaking to you in the future and hearing from you in the BA community more widely. So thank you again.
Thank you.